Good afternoon. I call the special meeting of the Ames City Council for Friday, January 31st to order. Good afternoon, Council. We only have one item on the agenda beside disposition of communications and council comments, and that is our annual budget overview for recommended 2021 fiscal year. So, Steve.
I'll start off. We appreciate the council taking the time. We're actually kicking off your overview of the session, but I want to assure you, we began working on the CIP and the budget back in August, believe it or not, through department heads, also had some input at our town budget meeting and tried to prepare a budget for the council consideration that we hope meets the service level demands of our citizens. We've tried to take into account, as you'll see, some of the input we received at the town budget meeting and other sources of input areas and try to incorporate them into the budget. We're always cognizant of what the cost will be. So I think our department heads did a great job of trying to hold the line on their budgets as much as possible. As you'll see, Dwayne will go over, we have a bit of challenge this year, extra challenge in the rather low level of in the increase in our taxable valuation. And he'll go over that caused by the rollback going down, and he'll go over that. Plus, just a combination of our exemptions and tax abatements, which we normally grant throughout the years. That combination really posed a challenge to us. We're going to be talking about my recommendation for fiscal year 2021 and the expenditures associated with it. But you'll recall we also look at the current fiscal year. We're about halfway through it, so we're going to be asking you to, at the close up, to actually approve the adjusted budget as we see it now. You'll have one more chance, and we'll look at it in May, but you'll see we've had a number of months under our belt, and we've changed some of the projections there. So you're also going to be asked to approve the new estimate for the current fiscal year. So all the information we have before you, I passed out to the City Council. We have information, the budget itself, the proposed budget, the presentation Dwayne will give you today. We have information packet. We have a budget schedule for you. We have, for your consideration, the recommendations on asset quota and the outside funding sources. They're all laid before you, but I want the public to know they're currently now on our website. So we're going to be going through this for a number of weeks. You won't make your final decision until I think it's the 11th, right? February 11th. But I wanted to make sure the public gets to see all the information that you see, and there might be input along the way too from them. We hope that's the case. So we'll start off, if that's okay. We would like to keep this informal if possible. We're going to go over a lot of information. We're going to stay today at the 20,000 foot level. We're not going to get into the actual programs or activities. The departments will lead you through that next week. This is the broad kind of economic overlay, financial overlay that we're going to talk about, and the impact it will have on taxes and utility fees for our customers. That's usually what the first thing they ask about. The actual service level demands and how we're going to meet them will be dealt with next week. Okay? So we can start out and keep it informal. Interrupt us if you would. Dwayne will start off and give our presentation.
Thanks, Steve. We'll have a PowerPoint up that can be seen for anybody watching electronically, but primarily I'll be walking through this document called Special Reports. And the PowerPoint slides won't match exactly because we try to summarize that information so it's a little bit more visible for the public. And this PowerPoint's out there also if people just want a quick summary, they can go through that. I'll kind of page through this document, and we'll go back and forth a little bit, but just you won't all see all the same information on the PowerPoint that we see here because we have quite a bit more. We always like to mention that we'll only be talking about the city's portion of your property tax levy. As everybody knows, I think we make up about a third, and that hasn't changed too much over the last several years. And this is an example of how your consolidated property tax levy is broken out if you're within Ames City and the Ames School District. You know, we have a growing area that's in the Ames City, but the Gilbert School District, in that case, we make up a smaller portion of the total levy. And I don't have that out here for you this afternoon, but we could get that. And that's because the Gilbert School levy is a little bit bigger. These are 1920 rates or our current year, and we'll be talking about this portion of property taxes. So just big picture, kind of some of the things, quick summary, as Steve mentioned, this is maybe at the 50,000 foot level. And right now we're only talking about property taxes. We'll hit the rest of the budget and some other areas pretty soon. But the property tax rate will be increased. The proposal is up 12 cents from 1920. And we're impacted by the lowest rate of increase in our taxable value in over 10 years at just a little under 1.1%. We have a modest increase in total tax dollars. That's driven partly by some increased revenue and also by departments having pretty tight budgets. But the increase in tax dollars is not evenly spread across the different classes of property. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We'll go through that. That's not an uncommon situation with the rollback and the way different classes are reassessed from year to year. We have a balanced general fund budget for operations and capital, and that means we'll bring as much revenue into the general fund to cover all the expenses, and that's for the budget year for 2021. We're forecasting 5% growth in local option sales tax revenue. We talked about that during budget issues clear back in December this year, wasn't it? When I got direction from council for asset and CODA and some of those other areas that are funded by local option sales tax. But with our referendum, 60% of that increased growth goes directly to reduce sales tax or property tax. So that's a plus for the taxpayers here in Ames. And we'll have some utility rate increases both for water and sewer, and we'll hit a little bit on that later on.
Dwayne, could you just, on the forecasting 5% growth in local option sales tax revenue, can you just give us an approximate amount, like so our residents know?
Yeah,
how much
impact
that
on
is?
property tax is about $250,000.
Yeah.
So it's pretty significant, and
So that 5% represents about $250,000 reduction in required levy, what is levied to collect for property taxes, right?
that's correct.
So I think it's important for our community to know that it's not insignificant. And thank you to the legislature for passing that law that requires them to collect the local option sales
Right.
tax.
Yeah,
But
I
it's-
failed to mention, that's I believe where we're seeing that growth. So that's the online sales. That's our forecast of that coming through, and we've seen some increases there.
And we can't necessarily say that it's all from online sales. What the point is
No,
that it's helped though.
But just to clarify, that $250,000 is an additional amount.
Yes.
The total amount, the 60% that
Yeah.
goes to reduce property
Right.
taxes is substantially larger. You'll see that when you do the fund balance.
Yep.
We have a page that breaks down the consolidated levy. There's a lot of information there, so I don't have a slide on that. And then we also have a slide that has a comparison of the other cities, just so that people can get an idea of where we are compared to the larger cities in Iowa. Ames fares pretty favorably if you want to look at comparisons. We had a levy rate current year of about 10.07 is the second lowest of all the other larger cities. We're one of 3 cities that is below the $8.10 limit on our general levy, and that's really important to point that out this year. So with rollback going back and a very small reduction, or in some cases, cities may see no increased valuation, And if you're already at the $8.10 limit, that means there's no ability to increase taxes, to even keep them the same, to pay for the same services. So in our case, and I'll show you what happened to the general levy, council has the flexibility to maintain services by changing the levy rate, even if it doesn't increase tax dollars.
Wayne, one thing, I think it's interesting to note for those of you not aware, the public for sure, on page 2 in the consolidated levy, you had just talked about the assessor, the city assessor's budget. It's interesting to note, if you look at that page 2 in your packet, the assessor's budget actually is reflected in the county tax rate. You'll see that if you look at the bottom, it says Story County. The city assessor, which you've just contemplated with all the members of the conference board, doesn't show up in the city's levy, what Dwayne's talking about. Well, we're going to talk about property taxes. It comes out of property taxes out of the county levy. See city assessor down there to the left? I'm not sure. People get confused on that sometimes because it's called the city assessor. And it isn't located in our tax asking. It's not.
Right, so that would be part of that gray 20% portion of the total consolidated levy, and the assessor's small part of that, like 35 cents out of the 650.
Don't they have an assessor too?
Pardon me?
Don't they have one too, an assessor?
They have a count. Yeah,
Yeah,
Why
they
is
have a
it that on
county
there?
assessor.
they have a county assessor. Let's see.
We get a separate levy than the county does.
I
This
see.
is the levy that goes to
Yeah,
the
they have the rural,
cities.
they have the rural and the.
Sure, okay.
So next page, we provide a breakdown of the levy, and this is just a summary of it up here on the slide. And, we can see with just 1.1% growth in valuation, that tends to drive our taxes up a bit if you have increased expenses. So I mentioned the general levy. We were at $5.52 last year. That's this levy right here. We're at $5.65 this year. That only increases the taxes a little bit over 3% as far as dollars goes. But if you were at the 810 limit, you would not be able to do that. You would collect just whatever you had. It would only be 1.1%. Other levies here. So that one's up about 13 cents or 3.45% in total dollars. The employee benefits levy, that's a permissive levy by the state where cities can levy any or all of their employee benefits. In our case, we only levy the police and fire, or the city contribution to the police and fire pension system. That levy rate's up about 2 cents, generates about another $85,000. That's right here. Transit levy, this is one that was almost flat this year, up 0.8 cents. 2.2% in total contributions from the city. So that's a fairly small rate of growth for a large transit system. They're going through some relooking at how they provide that service with the reduction in the students. And right now they're coming forward with a pretty tight budget for the year going forward. So that comes down to our total levy prior to debt service at almost $7, or up about $720,000. And then we add our debt service levy of about $3.15. That brings down to the total of $10.14, which brings in a total of just over or almost $32 million. In comparison to last year, the total dollars asked are up 2.52% from the prior year. So how does the rate have to go up? Just 1.17%. Our change in valuation was up 1.1%. So that's kind of the difference that brings us up to this 31.8. So up 2.52, 1.17% in the levy, and new dollars, 782,000. So just kind of as a comparison, last year at this time, we were looking at total new dollars of about double that, about a little over 1.5 million. So quite a bit tighter budget this year. And this includes a couple new employees and some additional services that we'll talk about later in the presentation and in more detail next week.
So for the public to understand, Property taxes paid predominantly for police, fire services, parks and recreation, and the library. Although there are other departments, planning and some of all of us, public works have it, but predominantly those four paid for the highest percentage of property taxes. So your services for those go to that. It goes there. You have public works and streets, debt service, and all those things. Those are the big ones. So about 782,000 is the number we're going to try to tie back to. Additional 2.52% includes three positions out of that. A new police officer position, new firefighter position, new recreation coordinator position. The total with roll up about $250,000 out of that $782,000. Without those new positions, that number of 2.52% would be less, obviously, significantly less.
So these next two slides kind of go together. This provides a little bit of history on what our tax levy has been for the last few years. And if you look back, 5 years ago, we were at 1037, pretty even the next year at 1038. And then we were down to 1007, down to 1003, and then up a little bit this year to 1014. And there was a lot of factors, obviously, that impact that, but let's jump to this. One of the biggest one is the change in valuation. So if you look at those years where we were able to reduce the rate quite a bit, we had really strong valuation increase. In fact, if you look back the last 5 years, it's been, the lowest was 3.8%. We did have a year back in 14-15 at 1.2, but I think I might have mentioned this increase of 1.1 is our lowest in over 10 years. I'll flip back to this slide. I don't have this one in the book, but I added this year because I thought it'd be good for the PowerPoint. It's kind of significant. We had seen really a reduction in the impact of our local option sales tax, a continuous reduction on the amount that was reducing the total levy, because that was growing at a slower rate than other revenues, other expenses. So if we went back to 16-17, that sales tax had the impact of reducing our levy by $1.80, dropped down to 176, 163, 159. And obviously, if that trend would continue and you want to maintain those services, we would have needed to increase this portion of the levy, or the property tax portion. But as you can see for this year, that's been reversed. That impact of that levy is bumping up, going up to $1.65. So the kind of quick way to look at this is if we did not have local option sales tax, our levy rate to deliver the same services would need to be $11.79 instead of the $10.14. So in this slide, we look at our assessed and taxable value. And, I think there's some good news here in assessed value. We continue to have pretty strong growth in the total assessed value. But this year, our taxable value, as I mentioned, did not grow quite as much, or not much at all. And a lot of that was due to, and we'll break that down, was due to rollback. So the residential property is taxed at the value based on the rollback, which this year went to a smaller percentage. Commercial and industrial are fixed at 90% of value. They used to be at 100. Multi-residential adjusts down every year based on a schedule from the state. And utilities, those are values given to us by the state. They're not a large portion, but they do change somewhat from year to year. So numbers to look at here. Change in valuation. Here we go. Taxable value down or up only 31.8 million. Let's jump ahead here. This slide just shows you kind of graphically where that goes, but one's a little bit more interesting. This slide breaks down the change in the taxable value. So there was that $31.8 million. So that's our increase in value. That's what we have available. Didn't pay taxes last year, or an increase to help fund services. We actually had new improvements of more than 3 times that amount. So this is new construction, property that was not on the tax rolls the prior year that's on now. And it was pretty strong across each of the classes. Not as high as it's been every year, but we had new improvements in residential, commercial, and multi-residential, and also in industrial. We had some changes in transfer between class. That overall reduced our value by about $5 million. We had increased valuations of about $53 million, so that's an increase in the value. But if you look up above here, essentially all of that came in the commercial class of property. So that was revalued fairly significantly this year. If you can remember, a couple years ago, there was a pretty significant change in residential value. So all that together increased our value by about $53 million. Over here is new or expiring exemptions. So this, I have a slide on this, or it's included in the book because there's a lot of information that breaks down what these are in total, not the change from year to year. But if you look at industrial at 15 million, if you remember, we did Barilla. They did an addition and they get TIF on that. So that pulls that value back out. It's not available for taxation. Here's some up here in commercial. We actually had some expiring in residential properties, so that added to the value. But net all in, that made a fairly significant reduction in our property taxes, $48 million. And then the biggest one, the biggest impact is rollback, which had the impact of reducing the value by $65 million in the residential class. Here we have the rollback. This is all multi-residential in this area. So the change in the rollback and the new and expiring exemptions, those two alone would wipe out 100% of the new value. So it's really kind of the, a lot of the increases based on revaluation of commercial property.
Dwayne, what's the, on the rollback, multifamilies on a, basically a continuous,
It's on a
Decline.
continuing scale.
do you know where
Yeah.
do you know where we're at right now on that and how much farther we have to go?
I do. I don't have that handy. I think we handed that out in December. I can look that up when Nancy's going through the funds, and
Sure.
I'll tell
Thank
you
you.
where we are.
Thank you.
There's so that I think it was 14, 15 when that started, and it was a 10-year schedule, I believe. So I think we've got a couple years left.
So industrial's at 90%
They're at 90%.
and residential was at 55% this year.
Residential was at 56.9, almost 57 for the current year. It drops down to 55
Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant for this
for this
fiscal year that
upcoming
we're
budget
looking
year.
at.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's correct. We'll jump back to this one. Yeah, we'll cover it here real quick. When we talked about the levy, there's a couple areas where we use some fund balance, and the biggest one is in debt service. And we've done this for years. We've looked at funds we have available in the debt service fund, and that's a fund that's restricted in use to pay back debt. So when we levy property taxes in that debt service levy, that one's right here. I'm sorry, right there. That levy, once we collect those taxes, it goes into a separate fund. The only thing it can be used for is to pay back debt. So occasionally we'll issue bonds for a lower rate. We may refund bonds. If we have bond proceeds and a project gets done at a lower amount, we have a couple choices. We can take that money, put it in the debt service fund and pay off future debt, or we can use it for like kind projects. Sometimes we do with both, but once we have that money in the debt service fund, we look over time and we try to even out our debt service levy. So if you look at last year, and that's right here, we didn't use any fund balance. We just let that go, and we had a debt service levy of about $3.19. This year, we used $375,000 out of that fund balance to help keep that levy rate down. We are still looking forward, though. We're not planning on using any money next year, And with our current CIP, and as we project debt service going forward, we could, again, lower our levy rate a little bit for debt service. It's a few more dollars, but we could lower the rate. And we could do that again the next year. It's up a little bit the following year. But as we get out in these fourth and fifth years, it's a little bit harder to predict. So we're in really good shape for those first 2 and 3 years. So we think that's a pretty prudent use of that fund balance.
Do you have a slide that shows what that the debt service fund balance is?
Yeah, we do. That's in the fund sheets. This schedule pretty much will spend it down. I think there's a little bit left.
So it'll be almost be depleted, but
Well, you know what likely happens, I know, we haven't done it yet, but the bond markets have improved significantly this week, especially. So we've contacted our bond counsel and our financial advisor. And when we hold our public hearing for the debt issuance, which we're looking at 10.6 million for this year, we'll actually hold the hearing for a refunding for 3 bond issues that are near maturity, but we'll still have quite a bit of savings. So if this holds out, we'll save some money. That'll go into this fund. We may have some projects close out. So even though this depletes most of it, it's pretty likely there'll be some additional fund balance going.
and then any projects which come in under budget, they get
We hope so. I mean, that doesn't always happen, but if it does, it's not like we lose out. So this slide shows the dollar value of well, I'm going to flip back to the packet here. If we can go to page 10. So I don't do a slide on this, so this is a pretty, there's a lot of information here, but this is another area that we're using fund balance. And this is in the police and fire pension system. That's a much smaller amount at $75,000. But again, we're using that fund balance to even out those tax levies over the next few years. This one goes way back to 1992, 93. And we do show this one depleting. There'll be no more funds coming into this. But there's been a lot of changes to that system. Hopefully they hold out. And I think we'll see our contributions rate levy out or even out over time. Next slide, and I don't have a slide on this one, but this just provides where that next CIP that's funded by bonds is going. You receive that in the CIP issue or the CIP book. We'll actually have some TIF that's included in there. That was in our CIP. But up above, if anybody wants to look at it, and this is at page 11, it breaks out where all those old dollars go. So those bonds that are issued and still outstanding. So, one that might, kind of stick out if you look at library, our debt service to cover the library is $1.2 million. So these are all broken out, and we'll pull those back together later on. Okay, I'm going to flip ahead now to page 13 in your book, and we have a slide on this one. And if you remember, we said our total levy was $31 million. And here it is down here. And we look at where are those levies coming from, or in total dollars, how is it paid across the classes of property? So if we look at residential that received the benefit of a rollback, that entire class of property combined paid about $20.2 million in the current year. So they'll actually be paying less taxes in total. That includes the new construction, existing property, everything. If one person owned all the residential property in Ames and all the new residential property, they would actually pay less money in city taxes for next year. Commercial and residential, obviously somebody has to make up that difference. They had the reassessment this year, so they'll be paying $816,000 additional. Industrial will be paying $9,000 less, almost the same. Utilities, very small difference. And TIF, we added some TIF property. They pay the debt service. So I think I mentioned Barilla got TIF. They added that value of $16 million. That is not totally untaxed. that is still subject to the debt service levy. So we will receive actually fairly significant additional tax dollars that goes to debt service. So $93,000. So there's our total levy, 776. Then there's some adjustments for military exemption and utilities subject to excise, and that comes down to that total $782,389.
So that tells you who's going to pay for it for our increase by class, recommended increase.
And Dwayne, I think you made this point, but I just want to go over it again. So this kind of makes it look like we're controlling the levy on residential and commercial and industrial separately, but that's not really how it works, right?
That's not how it works. And we'll go back and show you a few years prior and where we had the opposite situation, where there was revaluation of residential and commercial was on the other side of this equation. So they were, as a total class, they paid less taxes, and all of the increase was picked up by the residential property. All of that's out of our control. We don't set the valuation. We don't set the rollback. I think it might be nice if things went evenly across all the properties, but that's not the way it works in Iowa. It does even out pretty well over time, though. So the next page in the book, I don't do a slide on this, but that kind of gives you a breakdown of that information a little bit further. That's page 14.
In your packet?
And here's the breakdown of those new taxes, and I do have a slide on this. So this is that same amount. And what was the impact? So there's the new taxes, $782,000. So had we just collected taxes on the new growth, that would have generated more money than this, $1.1 million. So had nothing changed, we had the same rate, we would have collected more money than what we have levied. But there were some other things that had a separate impact. We had existing property, primarily due to rollback, that cuts out $663,000 in taxes. Commercial that's primary multi-residential, there's another $82,000 out. So those adjustments are what pulls that money away, so to speak. Then you had an increased rate, which adds $365,000. In this slide, I try to break out between new property and old property. So new property would pay $1.1 million. If you look at all the old property combined, or the existing property combined, as a group, and now it's all in the residential class, they will be paying less taxes than they were the prior year. So in other words, if we didn't have any new growth, that rate would have to be quite a bit higher to generate the same amount of taxes. This slide just provides a little bit of information on valuation by type. This moves a little bit from year to year, but Ames is a pretty heavy weighted towards a residential valuation, and that continues to be the same, a little less so for this year. And if you look at those numbers, so here's the residential portion of our taxable value for the current year. And this is what it is for the budget year. So that's down, about 2%, almost exactly what the rollback is. So that's what's really impacting that. Commercial and multi-residential, there became a larger portion of it then. They're about a third, a little less than a third. And industrial, we're fairly low category for Ames at 4.5%. And that's the 100% of the taxable value. And there is a little difference between taxable and assessed. Residential makes up almost 3/4 of our assessed value, but 63% of the taxable due to the rollback. So if we take all that information, it gets together in the levy. So how does that impact the taxpayers? So this first slide, we just look at what the rate was, what the rate is proposed to be for next year, And how does that impact $100,000 of value? So for residential property, they paid on almost 57% of the value, as we just mentioned a few minutes ago. So last year they would have paid on 56.9 at this rate, $10.03, or $570. And the proposed rate goes up 12 cents, which is 1.17%, but the rollback went down at a greater rate than the increase in our property tax rate. So that would result in a reduction in their property tax payment. So they would go from 570.64 per 100,000 of value down to 558.60. So down about 2.11%. Commercial property does not get additional rollback, so they are going to be up exactly the amount of our levy increase, 1.17%. Industrial, same thing, 1.17%. But every year, we know that people's valuation doesn't always stay exactly the same. The 100,000 that was last year could be a different number this year. We already mentioned that commercial was revalued. So we like to take a look at if your property goes up exactly by the change in valuation of your class and property, and we know that people are going to be above or below that. What would be the impact on your taxes? So if you're a residential property and you were changed in value exactly by the average in the class, which was very small, you would actually be up a little bit over $100,000. You would still get the rollback. That would still result in a fairly significant reduction in tax dollars, about $12, a little over 2%. Commercial was revalued up about 6%. So if you went up that average amount, your tax bill is going to go up $67.79, or about 7.51%. So obviously a pretty big difference between the classes of property. When you look at a levy only going up 1.17%, one group's going down, another group's going up. There was a little bit of a change in industrial, but we've only got a little over 40 properties, so that was just a couple properties. But as a class, they're down. The vast majority will pay 1.17% additional.
To follow up what David asked, we're not allowed to change and have a different rate for each one of those classes. So you establish one rate, and obviously it's affected by the assessed valuation. If commercial and industrial, their rollback didn't go down, right? They came down and had the benefit a number of years ago from going to 100 to 90. The residential has the rollback. So the one rate results in a different kind of increase, but we can't adjust for it. You can't treat one differently with a different tax rate.
Steve, I have some questions on the percentage change. A lot of what we're doing flows from how we think about the 1.1%. And when you go back and you look at the chart that you provided, when we dropped down to 1.2%, it was really an aberration. We had been going along in the threes, and then it dropped down to 1.2. And the very next year, it was back to 3.9%. So here's a hypothetical I would like to ask you, because none of us have a crystal ball, but I'd like to play out this hypothetical. If we knew that next year our percentage change would be comparable to this 1% increase, if we knew that, would that change the way that we would budget this year? That's one hypothetical. So if we just stayed flat, okay? If we think about it from the perspective, if our percentage change decreased further, would that presumption change the way we think about our budget this year?
Well, I'm not sure what you're asking, because I think we have an obligation, and maybe a legal obligation, to only establish a tax rate that covers our costs. So are you maybe suggesting if we knew it's going to be a bad year, we may increase the rate even more? Are you suggesting? Because you have to have expenditures to cover those. So are you asking what will we do? How would it affect our budget? Do you mean would our tax rate be different, our asking be different, either up or down? Is that what you're asking?
So, yeah, I apologize if the question was a little bit fuzzy. So you're making recommendations to us in terms of expenditures. based on our capacity, the taxpayer's ability to repay that, right? So we're going to be generating revenue. We're going to be drawing on some funds to pay the bills.
Right.
My question, we're looking at this in this tax year. But it seems prudent for us to think around the dais that if this was not an aberration and this stayed flat, my question is, as a staff, would you be recommending that we do anything different? For example, we could pare back on our expenditures.
Right.
We're adding, I think, 3 FTEs, right? So we don't have to add 3 FTEs, but you're recommending it, and we know that you're very conservative on adding FTEs.
Very conservative.
But if we knew that the percentage was going to remain flat, I'm asking the question, do you think that that would impact the way we think about this budget?
I think it's a good question. I'm always optimistic that the next year is going to be better, and I would hate to cut back services to people right now based on projecting a poor year next year. I think if there's a trend developing, then we think we've locked into something. But I don't think at this point, again, we're only asking for 2.5% more. You have to understand the departments are predominantly personnel services make up a predominant part of the budget. And a 3% with roll-up, and we put those in all the general fund departments, and we're only asking for 2.5 in new tax money. And that includes those 3 positions. I think it's pretty lean. So I'm not sure what I cut back even more today without getting into service level cutbacks. And I don't want to cut back today based on something that could happen in the future, and I don't know if it's going to happen. When I see that bad piece of news next year, then the departments will they'll have a justification, I think, for responding that way.
And I agree. I think it's good that we have this conversation. I think we have to make decisions based on data, and I think we've had an aberration, but it's a pretty significant jump from a 5.7 to 1.1. And we have been used to having very strong growth in Ames. We haven't had to make cuts the way that other communities have had to make cuts. So I'm very comfortable with the budget you're recommending, those general high-level numbers today. We'll go down into some particulars.
Yeah.
But I think it's helpful as a council that we understand that if this trend were to continue, then that's going to cause us to think differently about our expenditures. That's really sort of the point of the exercise.
Certainly, if people don't want to raise their taxes to maintain the same level of service, you'd have to cut back.
Correct.
And I don't want to be cavalier about it, but you're focusing on the right thing. It's really the $782,000 because you've got to determine what you think that's an appropriate amount of additional spending, because we will react. If assessed values go down, we have the ability to react because we're not at 810 limit. We can react by raising rates. If assessed values go up, as they did 2 years ago for residential, we lowered rates 30 cents. So really, you should be focusing. We have the flexibility to move in either direction, but what impacts the tax is that $780,000, the additional amount.
Right.
So I'm glad you're not focusing on the rate increase or the rate decrease. The taxes are going to be affected by that number. Now, is that a legitimate number? That type of increase of 2.5%, I think, is very prudent expenditures for the level of service we provide and the variety of services that are provided by the general fund departments. But again, I'd hate to cut back now and on anticipation of another bad year. I just don't know. I mean, I'm hopeful that our internet sales, we just scratched the surface of getting that. That was the first year. And maybe they're getting the system better in place. Maybe I'm hopeful we'll get even more internet sales, and our local option will go up just a little bit more too, which will help for property tax relief. And it also helps you look back. You have to understand our growth was robust at 105,000. You cannot control the assessed valuation. But remember those exemptions and tax abatements? It's a balance, and no one's more conservative than I am, and I recommend those in a lot of areas. But you have to be conservative there to make sure you want to do a deal that gets the project you want, right? It's just like when you buy a house or a car. You don't want to do any more than that. It's necessary to get the deal done. So I think you have to be very prudent when you deal with the exemptions or abatements that we control in policy. You still want to give them. I don't want you to think I'm not saying that. You can't give them to everybody. You got to be prudent, and you can't give it for as long as maybe people want it. But there's an argument, if you don't give it at all, they'll locate someplace else. I don't know. It's a balance. So you control that too. And I'm not asking you to stop giving abatements right now. I don't think we have to.
So obviously, we all hope that this is an aberration and that we will return to a more robust rate of growth. But I think it was good to just hit the pause button for a moment and just think about that. That number is very important for all the planning we're going to do in this budget process.
But I have to tell you, Tim, I live in fear of another unknown we don't control. What could happen from the state level? Every year, I'm concerned about it.
In terms of
They can make
backfill,
a lot of things. They can put restraints on you to even raise taxes. They could take away revenue they give you now that's in our base. I mean, if you want to look at it that way, we're always kind of concerned that that's going to happen. Not even the valuation. If some of that money is taken away from state or federal money is reduced, or they put more restrictions on us or mandates that cause us to spend more money that we're not spending on now, I mean, that could cause us to go another direction.
that's fair.
That always looms out there. It's always something that scares me at night.
Thank you.
So we went back, Steve asked me to look a little bit at history on the different classes of property because it was a little bit unusual this year for the commercial to be up at a higher rate than residential. And that's because that has not been the trend in the last few years. We've had revaluation and rollback essentially going the other direction. So this is just a chart that goes back the last few years. So here's the current year we've budgeted. Residential as a class is down 2%. Commercial is up 7.51. But if you go back last year, residential was up 2.5. Commercial was down 0.5%. Back 2 years in 18-19, residential was up 3.45. Commercial was down again 0.44%. So in those years, and with industrial being down a little bit also, the residential class essentially was picking up 100% of the increase in property taxes from year to year, plus a little bit more. You go back another year, the fourth year back, residential was up 2.82. Commercial was up just under 1%. They were closer back in 16-17. Residential up almost 1%, commercial up 1.45. So, bottom line in each of these years, the residential class was up 4 of the 5, down 1. Commercial was up 3 of the 5, down 2. If we average them out, and this is just a straight average, I ran it as a percentage growth, and it was about the same. It's a small enough number of years, so it doesn't make a big difference. But average-wise, residential's up 1.44 over that period. Commercial up 1.77. I think if we go back further, they'd be even closer. But if you go back 2 more years, in 15-16 and 14-15, those were the 2 years that the commercial and industrial classes were rolled back from 100% to 95% in 14-15, and then 90% in 15-16. So in those years, they were down about 5% each year. However, we received replacement tax money for that amount. So, they paid less taxes, but we received some additional revenue to help that hopefully we continue getting over the years. So they do become pretty close when you go back and look over time. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in the packet. We can flip back to some of these, but
Can we do one thing before you do?
sure, absolutely.
I'd like Nancy to go over page
19?
19. And this is a key part because I want to slice this for you again. You need to know that additional amount I'm requesting to pay for those departments that are funded by the general fund. We're asking for $782,000. The question is, where does that 782,000 go? So we tried to show you that. I think Nancy does a good job of breaking that down, and that's on page 19.
So what we do is we analyze, how did we get to, for the general levy, it was 587,407 additional funding that we needed from property taxes for this year. So where did that number come from? So we look at what the change was in all of the non-property tax revenue, which of course this year the local option sales tax transfer for property tax relief was significant. All other revenues, and this includes revenues for Parks and Rec, ISU contributing to fire, all other revenue classes was only an additional 370,687. Then we also look at the change in expenses. And like Steve had mentioned, the largest one for the general fund is personnel services. So they were up 3.7%. And that included, I've got in here 3.55 new FTEs. I think the Parks and Rec was actually 1.75, 1.1 was general fund. And then we also have a 0.45 increase at animal control. Health insurance, we're projecting that will increase 3.9. So that was almost the entire increase that we needed for general fund was just for personal services. You can see for contractual services, they actually reduced it in their budgets this year. For commodities, they were only up 1.4%. Capital, it's a very small amount. I think that's a treadmill for the gym is the only thing that we have budgeted this year for capital. And then some of the other expenditures that are actually up a little bit is because we bring in transit levy and hotel motel tax receipts into the general fund, and then we transfer them out to the special revenue funds. But overall, 3.1% increase, but 3.7% was personal services, and everything else, they held their budgets really tight this year.
Yeah. Is that helpful? So you know where it's going to?
So how, I see I follow the change in expenses and the change in revenues. I'm trying to follow when you get the 1.203 million for total change in expenses, less the total change in non-property tax revenue. Help me understand. I'm sure I'm missing something. That the 615 minus the 1203
Yeah,
is not equal to 782.
No, it
so-
should equal the 587,
Pardon me?
407. It should equal the general levy.
Oh,
is
I'm sorry.
587.
That's just
I got
one
it.
levy.
I got it.
And then we add the other levies on top to get to the
Thank you.
782.
Yep, got it.
Just the general.
Yeah, the other levies are just one class of expense. So it's just debt service is either up or down. Transit's either up or down.
Okay, you understand that?
Yep.
One other thing I want you and the public to know then, we didn't mention the balance, did we? Could you just mention the balance? what we
Not
got built
mentioned
in
balance.
Before we go into the impact?
General fund?
The general fund balance, first of all, not the additional balance, just what we've got built into the budget. What percentage increase and then the
Okay. So, that's the wrong fund. So the general fund balance, which actually is in your book on page 249 through 251. And we have the ending balance, of course, to meet our 25% reserve that we maintain every year. And then we've also very deliberately over the last few years kept an additional amount to cover the state replacement tax if we would happen to lose that. And we're still at, I calculated it before I came up, we're at 27.9% fund balance for 2021 and 28.7 for 1920.
Which page was that, Nancy?
That is on the bottom of page 251, where it shows where the balance stands going across the ending balance.
So 25% is the council policy target, and that was based on the Moody's recommendation for a AAA rated city. We're slightly under AAA rating for our bonds, but we'd like to get back there. So this is one area we could control.
So the 8.832 million is a 25% city council reserve fund that we want to have. And in addition, we have an additional 1.032 million on top of that.
Right.
So that's your 27 or what?
Yep, 27.9, yep.
So the 8.8 plus 1.03, those two combined, the total is 27%. Is that right,
Right.
Nancy? Thank
Yep.
you.
Okay, similar we had last year. One other item I want to point out on page 21 before Dwayne goes on again. So our departments do a great job too in all funds, but certainly in the general fund. But we have items budgeted and sometimes we have some savings and they do a good job just not spending at the end of the year what we have. And we track that very closely. So we look closely at the ending balance for 18-19 and then the projected ending balance for 19-20. And fortunately, I think it's fortunately, we have some savings there. Projects came in under what we anticipated, operating costs were under. Sometimes we have salary savings. This has to do with the general fund now I'm talking about. On page 21 then, we have a balance left over that I normally advise you not to use it to reduce next year's operations because it's a one-time balance that will go away. So take advantage of on one-time items that we can pay cash for, so I don't have to put it in the future budgets and raise taxes for. So I've got a list here of the items that that will show up in the estimated column for 19-20. And then that's the list of all the things I'm recommending we spend the balance on. It still leaves us, even when you take this out, you're still going to end the balance next year, what we talked about.
Yeah.
We would just had a bigger balance. You could use it to reduce property taxes. Be a very poor decision on your part because you'll get bit the next year. You'd have to come up with that $1.4 million and then some, just to break even. So you'd have to raise taxes to get that buffer.
So I'm clear. On page 21, we're showing a 1.645 general fund balance, or projects that we could use for projects.
They are already in my budget right now, so therefore they show up as expenditures in 19-20. They don't create a bigger balance. We used it up. The
Yep.
balance that
Yep.
Nancy talked about has these already out.
Yep.
If
So-
you don't approve these, it will make the balance at the end of 2021 even larger.
Yep. So page 251 reflects the fact
Yes.
that the city manager's got all these projects already in.
Yes.
So I need to think.
In fact, if you go to page, some of these are bricks and mortar. You can see them here. Other places, we put it on page 199, I think you'll see. I've tried to respond to the city council's values that we establish and goals. If you look on 198, excuse me, in the adjusted column for 19-20, there were some unbudgeted items that we wanted to meet your initiatives. So if you look at the left-hand column, going down to the second kind of area, I have a greenhouse gas inventory. It wasn't budgeted, remember, but we're doing it now. We're going to take it out of the balance. I've got a climate action plan. You've really never adopted that, but I'm assuming you are. I'm prepared. I'm trying to help you accomplish your goals. So I put it in there. Our best guess is $130,000. Could come in less or more. We have our internet improvement study. Had the budget for that. We're about to start that, $120,000. So you see, I've tried to put those, and those are coming out of kind of the balance too. So I want to show you, it shows up in a number of places. In this other column here, I have not only the bricks and mortar, we have an auditorium, air conditioner system needs to be repaired, and a lot of other items. I also want to move ahead with some conceptual planning to get you a cost for the relocation of Fire Station 2. We'll have money set aside for an indoor aquatics center conceptual plan. You're not approving this project. You just need to get more information on what it would cost before you start talking about a bond issue. So we want to work on that, those two concept plans. I think you've given me direction to move another step in the swimming pool preparation and the fire station too. So that's been included in there.
Where are you at, Steve? I'm sorry.
It gets back on page 21 if you look there. Along with bricks and mortar type of things, we're going to do some conceptual planning, get you better numbers on things. I've also, with extra money, because you have before you a downtown plaza project, you'll notice I've allocated in the budget now another $700,000. That was in the sheet we passed out. If you noticed, had general fund funding for that. I'll have to pull out the CIP sheet. It went up to $1.1 million. You had already budgeted in prior years $400,000 for just general plaza work. I've carried it forward. Plus this 700,000 gives you the 1.1 of $2.5 million project, if you recall that. Okay, I just want to make sure you know what's in here.
So a couple of weeks ago, council approved the contract for the band shell improvements, electrical improvements. There's some rewiring.
Yes.
And there were some things that were left off because we didn't have money for it. And the meeting was getting late, didn't want to really drill down into it. But the question is, would the use of that facility be expanded, and could we improve the opportunities for our community for different events if we picked up? I think it was less than $50,000 or $60,000 total. I think.
I will have to ask, is Keith here? I don't think he's here, but the first one was to just replace wiring, if you remember. So that's
Right.
not going to expand anything. I have to go through all of them.
Well, one was to actually provide some boxes that you can actually have connect like food trucks and other things, additional things to the, or if you had larger sound systems coming in, you could just hook into it because there'd be external fuse boxes, and there was some other things. I just didn't know if that was something that would give entertainers more opportunities to come and use that. Maybe
Yep.
that'd be consistent with our quality of life and try and attract more events downtown. And maybe that would be something that we could, consider using this general fund balance. But that's kind of dropping something out of the air. But it's worth.
It's not job. I think we're still okay, because if you look at the balance that's projected for next year, it's a little bit above what we want. It's that you want. It's more than it's a little bit more than we have for the replacement money plus the 25%. What you don't want to do right now, we want always to show our bond people that revenues equal expenditures. So what could happen is we can do an adjustment through the year for this year, maybe spend more money that will reduce next year's ending balance without changing the budget, and still come in above our 25%. So we just have to see what we have.
Well, I just know that you'll never get it done cheaper than when they're actually on site and try and pick those up. But I think it's a question maybe for Parks and Rec in terms
Yep.
of other things. They wouldn't have put those alternates in if they
Right.
didn't think there'd be some value for the overall use of the facility. But anyway, it's just worth it. Just
What we don't have, unfortunately, if the big project I'm worried about looking forward to also is the clubhouse and if it's 200,000, I don't know we can chunk that down right now. But that's why we have the park development plan fund. We'll have to replenish that in future years. If I have savings next year's like this, you might see me replenishing that fund. We're very fortunate to have this, because again, if I told you I had to raise the budget by $1.6 million, you probably wouldn't like that. So, or you tell me not to do it, but I think these are projects that are well worth it, either in service levels or maintaining our facilities. Okay, make sure you know that. Or I'm sorry, Dwayne, I want to get those out before.
You go to this, cost of services. So if you remember this slide a little bit back, we talked about a residential property that was valued at $100,000, and what would you pay in taxes with our proposed budget? And it's about $559. And we always like to look at where does that go? So we've got this graphically up here in the PowerPoint and also on page 22. A little bit of a difference. If you look way down at the bottom, building safety the last 2 years has not impacted the property tax levy because they've had pretty significant permit revenue. So I put them up with fire protection. But this is where the dollars go. The biggest portion of it is to streets and traffic, and that is almost exclusively for debt service that pays for those programs. So we not only divvy up the operating, we go back to that slide where we looked at where does all the debt service go, and we apply it to whatever project it was used for. The biggest program area would be our protective services, police and fire. As Steve mentioned, when you look at property taxes, what you can impact, this is the biggest area. When we look at streets and traffic, that's debt. That's all, in most cases, already in place. You've issued that. You can't really change that very much going forward. You can just issue less new debt. Library, that's the next category after police and fire. That also includes the debt for the renovation of the library. Parks and recreation at 30 is not, part of the recreation receives some revenue, but parks does not really have another source of revenue other than property taxes. This is the transit levy. General support services, that's a lot of different areas. Planning, stormwater. Stormwater, we have a utility fee, but it pays for 100% of the operations and part of the capital. Some of the capital is done through debt service. As you can see here, that's a fairly small portion of your property tax bill. Resource recovery also operated as a utility, but as you know, all the member communities pay into that to help offset the cost of that. And for Ames residents, that would be $6 per 100,000 of residential value out of your property tax bill. Animal control, $5, and facilities and cemetery, about $3. So that's a breakdown. Anybody's interested where their cost of the services go.
So why is stormwater, I mean, we don't have any other utilities, water plant, wastewater plant, or electric. And doesn't the stormwater come on isn't that
We do operate as a utility for the operations and part of the CIP, but there's a couple things that go on. One, that fee was fairly new, and we didn't set it at a rate where it could cover some of the larger projects. And also, in some cases, they're really tied in with other public works projects. So there's other things combined. There may be a stormwater component.
to the streets and traffic?
Yes, exactly. But we pull that out and we show that, part of that expenditure is going to stormwater, so people know.
And streets and traffic, that would also include all of Public Works staff?
No.
No.
That's mostly covered in the streets and traffic area by the road use tax fund. So this is primarily debt service that has gone for
Central
street
corporate purse for
repairs.
streets and traffic improvements that we have to issue bonds for. You pay that under that debt service levy.
Okay.
So there is some operating, some general fund money, but very small in traffic engineering and such. Predominantly, that's the debt.
Yeah,
on
the
your-
vast majority is debt in that category.
So the parts of the bicycle infrastructure that are part of the streets are here, but the trails are not. Is that,
No, we'll be here.
in streets and traffic?
Are you talking about are you trying to make it 6 feet on-street bike paths?
Yes.
Well, it would also be if they're in the parks. Are you talking about, how about,
Well,
there's trails in the parks too. They do the
So-
operating expenses here too.
So some of our trail system is on street, and that's streets and traffic, and some of our trail system is part of the parks,
We actually have 3 different ones. We have off-street paths
which are
That-
not part of the parks.
where they're not part of the parks. We have pass-through parks like Brookside, and then we have on-street parks, which are like streets. They're just widening of streets. Most of those would be, well, no, I take that back, because you have a capital improvement that has maintaining some of our paths through local option tax. Remember that?
Mhm.
So it's not all 100% in taxes. And it could be in road use tax too if it's tied to a road. So if you want me to break down the bike paths through all the different funding sources, I have to do that separately.
So this graph just shows the breakdown of the property tax.
Only
That's
property
right.
taxes, not the sum total of it all. Yeah, good point. Okay, that puts it in perspective, I hope, for people, what they get, and that's on a yearly basis, what they get. It's a pretty good value, I think, for their money.
So next page in the packet, page 24, provides some historical information on FTE's levy rate, change in valuation. I think we go way back here to 08, 09, when we had that increase. It was lower than this year at 0.4%. If you think back to those years, I mean, that was right at the heart of the credit crisis and the recession, not only in the U.S., that was a worldwide situation, and there wasn't very much construction back then, or not near as much as we have the last several years. But it gives a rollback percentage, and you can see that's changed significantly over the years. Next page provides some additional information on FTEs, and I didn't know, Steve, do you want to do any more details on the FTE? I don't have a slide on that, but page 26 provides changes in FTEs that are included in this budget. That's probably the most important part.
That's it?
Yep. Mhm.
And if you have any questions, I've been trying to build both the police force and the fire departments over time rather than have a big bump or a big push in property tax at one time. So for the past 3 or 4 years, we've been adding police and fighters to the budget. I'll continue that this year. And then I think we talk about animal control. We have an increase there. It's really a part-time person. We're increasing to 3/4 time. We hope to have more service hours or availability to staff the animal control shelter and be out in the road or out in the field with this. But also, we're going to switch the responsibility for supervising or administering the dog park from Parks and Rec. They will maintain the field, the grounds, but the actual administration of it, monitoring of it, will be with the professionals in the animal control shelter, who I think have relationships with a lot of the animal owners there. So that'll be a switch, but we wanted to increase the hours for that person. And then you're always advising me to think about succession planning, and I think we've had some pressures in the Parks and Rec department with some of our recreation managers who have to supervise facilities that are open 7 days a week, not 24 hours, but a lot of the hours, more than 8 hours. And we're finding we had a lot of turnover in doing exit interviews. It's just a lot of time that one person is responsible for dealing with those. So I'm trying over maybe the next year or so to create a lower level position. It'll be a recreation coordinator. I only have one new one in this budget. There'll be entry level positions, right out of college, people who have majored in the field. We'll get them as professionals. They will have to help us staff some of the recreation programs and facilities during the weekends and nights. They'll get great experience, and if unfortunately our rec managers move on, we'll have trained that group to move up. So that's a start there. And in the aquatics, outdoor aquatics facility, we're not hiring a new person. We're increasing some temporary times to make them 3/4 to be lead workers, which will accomplish the same thing. They're more seasonal, so we don't have to have a full-time position. These temporary positions will help the manager, the pool manager itself, manage a facility that's open many, many hours, again, 7 days a week. And we're also making improvements in the ice arena, I believe, too. That shows up in a different fund. That's not property tax. We're trying to get some lead workers to help out there. Aquatic Center, we're actually having people who will help that manager. One will be assigned to the concessions operation. One will be the deck, pool deck, with the lifeguards, and help monitor and manage that for the person, so they don't have to work all those hours. So, and I do have an additional maintenance worker in the utility maintenance of public works. You know, the growth in the demand we've had for water main breaks and sewer main breaks we've had over the years. And this is the second one we've added in 2 years. So we've tried to expand that so we can respond to our citizens' concerns as quickly as possible. So relative terms, what's the total there? It's not many, not many over the years and this year.
There.
Yeah, it's 5.2 in FTE increases, but not all that is in the general fund. Just want you to know that.
Steve, do you know how many people that translates into as employees?
FTEs.
Yeah, well,
Well,
we've got the
these people-
FTEs, but how many actual employees are reflected in the 59160?
591.60.
That's the 5.2 increase?
I believe.
Oh, I'm looking at page 26.
Oh, well, the full-time, obviously there, the 0.45 is one person.
Just
Okay.
going from part-time
Just going
to
part-time, that's all you're doing.
three-quarter time.
And then the,
The 1.75 is one full-time
Plus
and a
two.
couple part-time
So that's
positions,
three.
I believe.
so, and then one, so it's 1, 4, 5, 6, 7 bodies themselves.
And how many employees would that take us to total for the city? Do you know?
Well, we don't do, you want employees or FTEs?
Employees. I want to know how many people we have as opposed to the hours.
I don't have that here.
Yeah, it varies
Just wondered if you knew.
significantly. It's well
I
over
get it.
1,000. You know,
then
because we
there's-
have all the seasonals that come.
Now you got to have seasonal and temporary. They're different than the full-time. We can get all that for you. We can break it out.
I just wondered if you knew.
Don't want to give you the wrong answer.
An army of part-time
Have it.
people.
I appreciate the 7 people that you
Yeah.
have broken this out.
Thank you.
And I'd like to circle back to one thing. I think you explained it to me already, but earlier we were discussing the number of new FTEs in terms of 3.55 people, but that was just FTEs funded by property tax,
Right.
right? Okay,
Right.
so this is all the FTEs funded by whatever source.
Yeah,
All
for
right,
different
thank you.
funds. It could come out of the Ice Arena Fund, could come out of the Water and Sewer Fund, Homewood Golf Courses and Enterprise Fund.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was referring to the $782,000. Those were just general fund, ones that we charge to the general fund. Okay. Should we talk about?
Yeah, there's,
I've got something here, Dwayne, I handed out.
okay.
But do you already have it? You have
I've
a better
got, I
one?
know what they are.
You
Yeah.
got it? See if that's right.
So we've got several
It's very unprofessional.
details of fee increases included in the budget. The first one we'll talk about in the packet is utility rates and some increases. And we talk about this a little bit every year, and we try to put together a chart that projects out over 5 years. And you know, this is not the type of chart where you can just move it one to the left and add a year. We have to relook every year at where we are in utilities. Things change as far as the CIP. The actuals that come in change from year to year. But this is our best forecast as we have going forward. And for the current budget year, we're looking at an increase in the water rates of 2%, an increase in the sewer rate of 5%. And then if you look across at water, it's kind of, we previously were talking about an every other year increase, but we have some small increases in what would have been the off years. When we showed this to you last year, we were showing 0 for the current year for water, 5 for sewer. But for 21, 22, we thought we'd be at 9% for water, so we were able to pull that back a little bit. And then we were 0 for 22, 23. Now we're looking at a 2% increase. Sewer was unchanged. We did not have a storm sewer increase at the time, but we knew we needed one at some point. I think we were able to identify that the year that may need to happen is 22, 23. 5% increase, I believe, for them is a quarter on the rate. And that's our per ERU. 9% increase in water for 23, 24 is unchanged, and 24, 25 at 2%. Sewer at 8. So a couple other things that we need to look at that aren't, rate increases that people see on the utility bill is resource recovery. And we'll be having a census this year in 2020. And as I had mentioned earlier, we have a per capita fee that's charged to the member cities, and it's based on the census. It seems like not long ago, in 2010, we had a census, but at that point, we didn't need too much additional revenue for the resource recovery plant. So we actually lowered that per capita fee and did not really increase costs to the member cities based on the census. We're in the situation right now, and we'll talk about that in our operating budget, where we're going to need some additional revenue for the resource recovery plant. So our plan right now is to let that census go through at the current per capita rate, and that will be the same rate, but higher population. So that will, in effect, be a fee increase, and that'll include taxes for the city of Ames. That'll happen or get implemented in 21, 22. Then in addition to that, we're currently forecasting a tipping fee increase in 22, 23. And we believe that can then carry the resource recovery plant through the 5-year of the CIP. That's an area, where we're looking at the potential for some changes. So that one could look different next year when we come forward with the budget. But that's our best forecast right now. And
Can you give me 30 seconds? So electric, there are no fee increases.
there's no fee increases right now. We
Can you
had planned
explain
out.
that?
So
Yes.
if you remember when we did the conversion project from coal to gas, we issued some bonds, some revenue bonds in that case, and I believe we had a 4% rate increase at the time.
We did.
And we built in some, we had restructured the rates a few years prior based on our forecast for what was really a new expense structure for changing our fuel type. But even with that, we had thought that we would need a 4% or so increase in the energy cost adjustment, because at the time, when we were initially starting this project, gas was significantly more expensive than coal. Well, we got some pretty favorable contracts. The gas market has been really good, and electric's been able to lock in some of those prices. So in addition to not, and I'll show you the ECA in a minute, not needing to increase that, we've not needed to have a rate increase. And looking forward in the CIP, as of now, that could change next year. We're not looking electric increase. They've had the advantage of also some revenue growth. Part of the reason the water has those 2% increases is we've had some wet years. And that's really cut back on the water use, which is good from a conservation standpoint, but it does reduce their revenue. And they still need to cover all those fixed costs. So that's a lot of part of what's driving these 2% increases in the off years.
Is it fair to say that commercial people who may not be happy with the increase in their property taxes, if they're high electricity users, they should be happy that they're not going to see an increase in their
Right.
electricity rate? So we have some commercial users that are very high volume electrical users. So this is good news for them.
And we're very competitive. I think our rates, we could show you that.
Yeah, I think we know that some of our neighboring utilities have gone to the utilities board and asked for some pretty significant increases. I think some of them got carved back a little bit, but there's still going to be some increases, I believe, in some of the other electric utilities.
So you challenge us all the time, and I think it's the right thing to do, is to do long-range financial forecasting, and we do that. Dwayne, Don Com, John Dunn, they do a great job of looking ahead. And I always get nervous, though, because when I show you this, you always remember you promised me was going to be 0, and now you got a 2%. But these are plans, and they could change. Someone asked me, this does not include any loss in a major electric customer. If you lost a major electric customer about $500,000 a year, you lose $2.5 million off of a balance there. It will affect our need for a new rate. John Dunn will tell you, if it rains heavily for 2 years in a row, that affects our revenue. That could change, and that's what happened here. That's one of the reasons we change it. If we have a unfunded mandate or something from EPA or DNR, a nutrient reduction program that's not contemplated here, and it drives our expenditures up, that might change what you see here. So we're in matter of transparency, and once you know we look ahead on this, we are doing our best forecasting, but it could change, and that's what's happened here. We've got a little bit different than we showed you. We're going to challenge them to do better than this each year if we can, but it could change.
Okay, thanks.
So with regard to the resource recovery
Yes.
estimates, do we have customers who are going to be willing to pay that increase, or are we getting into the realm of it may be cheaper for us to go to Des Moines
We'll have
or
to watch
somewhere
that.
else?
We'll have to watch that, obviously. But when you go to Des Moines, you may pay more in gas, so
Yeah, I
they'll
know.
have to take the total cost into account.
And I haven't looked lately, but landfill tipping fees, we used to be a fairly significant amount higher than tipping fees. But if you look at Boone, that's part of the issue we're having right now. They've raised their tipping fees quite a bit. So we're closer than we were a few years ago. And, it costs us more to consolidate and haul it to Boone. It would cost even more to haul it to Des Moines. So by the time you add that in, we're still pretty competitive. And I think we will be at $62.50 2 years from now.
It's different, and the per capita is difficult too, because we actually lowered our rates, per capita, So it's lower now than it was before. Yet our expenditures keep going up, but we're sensitive not only to our own impact on taxes, because we pay about 500 and something $1,000 a year of the subsidy to support it, but all the other smaller towns in Story County too. So we have not tried to push that at all. Maybe we're saying we're going to have to start thinking about this. Not because there's anything wrong with the resource recovery operation. Our people do a great job, and you'll see their expenditures are down low again. It's just that we haven't, expenditures keep going up, but we haven't raised our revenue that much.
And are the customers that we have, the municipalities that are contracting with us on one-year contracts or
No, they're on
multi-year?
25 or 20 or 25. They're long-term contracts.
Okay, so do we know at what point in that contract cycle this
I
rate
can,
increases
no,
come?
I can find out. It's the second, I've been through 2 extensions. I'm not sure we are in the second extension of it.
Like
Yeah,
fourth or
four
fifth
or
year,
five
maybe.
years into a new contract.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got a significant amount of time before.
And that is it's a blessing for us because we share the cost, but it's also a little bit of a problem for us or a challenge, because let's say we want to do something totally different, with that, and you're not affecting just us, you're affecting them. And even if we want to make it improvements, we talked about a new burning system or something, if it costs $40 million, we got to make sure they're in with it. That's not part of the contract right now. So it's a little more burdensome trying to deal with a number of other small towns who are partners in with us. Any questions? You understand utility rates? You want to give some, just one or two?
Yeah,
sample bills?
we provide a couple samples where we'd like to, during this presentation, we're not proposing rates right now. We're proposing increase in rates to produce increase in revenue in 2% and 5% in sewer and water. John Dunn will come forward with a rate ordinance proposal that will break that out between
Couple weeks,
the
yeah.
fixed rates, and we'll get that in place. But what will be included in the budget, there needs to be a commitment to increase rates, or we need to go back and change the budget. So that's increased revenue is included in our budget. So just applying that evenly across the customers, this is our most common, our largest class of customer. This would be our median use residential customer. And we were talking about a 2% increase in water, 5% in sewer, but we look at the impact on the total bill. And I think someone did bring up electric, and that one does have a lot more impact on the bill. So not having that go up really makes the change a lot smaller in the bill. So the 600 kilowatt, 600 cubic foot use of water customer, and that's more than we use in our house, but it is the most common use amongst residential. Their bill would go up a little less than $2 or 1.41% for that 2 and 5 increase.
Per month. That puts it in perspective for you.
Median use commercial, so this is a much bigger electric user. This is a large power. This is a bigger customer. They're pretty electric heavy, but they have a lot of water and sewer included in here too. We calculate this on 15,000 cubic feet. These customers, I will mention, can vary dramatically because of the different type of businesses. But with them being even more electric heavy, the impact of that increase in water and sewer is about 0.5% or 0.47, $32. I will point out that, I talked a little bit about the energy cost adjustment. Right now, as of when we ran these, which was just a few weeks ago, that's actually a reduction in your bill. So we're getting energy at a rate, we're able to produce and buy at a rate that's slightly less than what we have calculated into the base rates right now. And we never kind of include that as part. We do include it in the analysis because we need to get the rate, but we don't show that as, hey, we have an reduction in electric rate, because that ECA will vary from month to month. So that's all I have for PowerPoint. We have included in the packet other rate increases that can be discussed more in detail as you go through the departments. Police department has a small amount of fee changes. Water and pollution control, when they increase those rates, Some of those flow through to fees. So John Dunn has laid those out. Again, he'll come back with ordinance changes when you get to that. Electric department fee changes. They had electric vehicle charging fees. I think it's switching from an hour to a per kilowatt hour. A Park and Rec Commission, they approved those fees separately, and I believe they went to the commission last Thursday. Those are included in here. Here's auditorium fees, and I think there may be some additional discussion on that as we go through their budget. Band shell. And again, Keith can cover these further. We did have some changes in the cemetery fees, and this is one that if you remember back on the section where we said, you know, how many dollars for each $100,000 in value, not too many years ago, the cemetery was self-supporting. So the fees that we paid covered the cemetery. And we've seen that deteriorate a little bit over the years. And, you know, when we look and do our surveys, you know, I think we've found that our rates are extremely competitive when compared to other cemeteries around the central Iowa area. So they've looked at those fees and are looking at, I think, what are some fairly modest increases. And then they're also trying to simplify that rate schedule. So if you look at the columbarium section there was a lot of different little fees that went into using a columbarium to place the ashes. So they've combined that together into a single fee.
So I want you to look at those closely because when we adopt the budget, we're going to be adopting it based on that revenue generated from those fees. So if come July, you say, oops, we don't support those fees anymore, we're going to be short because we're assuming that those fees are in place. Now, of course, we have to project how many people utilize it, so we could be short or long depending on that. But I want to make sure we're approving those fees at the same time, along with the budget expenditures. I think we haven't pushed them as much as we could, but I think we increased them a little bit of time. As far as building fees and rental housing fees, this budget does not reflect any increase or project any increase in those fees, which would be good news.
Can you get us this is the proposed Ames City Auditorium rates.
Yes.
Can you get us what the current are so we can compare these?
Yes. In fact, Deb and I and Keith, we owe you a report by next week on suggested alternative rates for nonprofits. Remember he gave it to us? What the issue will be, though, if you go along with something, will be short revenue, so we might have to increase the budget a little bit on that.
That's fine, but in part of that, can you include the?
Yep.
Yep, thanks.
But you had asked us to look in that, if you remember. All right, so fees, we talked about fees. You'll check those out.
Fees, the next page then in the packet, page 51, provides a breakout, and this is directly off the assessor's abstract, and these are all the abatements. This isn't the change from year to year, which I showed you earlier, which I get from him, but this is a total of the abatements across every area that there's an abatement. We do break it out by class of property because some of it's subject to rollback. So you can see, in total, abatements of taxable value, it's about $150.8 million. Part of that is subject to the full levy. Part of that abatement, in fact, it's split about half. So the TIF is still subject to the debt service levy. We'll still collect taxes on that. And then I break out what the impact of those. So assuming those all came on without any incentive, and as Steve mentioned, that would be a pretty long assumption, but we try to get the best deal that we can. But some of those, I think we can assume would not happen or not happen at the level that they occurred. But assuming it did, that would have the impact of lowering our taxes by about 39 cents. The good news is on that, these abatements are all temporary. So you're going to see that tax value come on at some point. So that's kind of dry powder and value that you'll see come on in later years.
Dwayne, I asked this morning, but now that I see the list here,
Yes.
which of these are under our control at this point? Is it just Urban Revite and TIF? Or,
Well,
because we've bought into some of these programs or
right.
approved some of these programs.
So Urban Revite is totally under your control. Industrial abatement is one that once we pass, you really don't control who gets it. If they qualify, they receive the abatement, and that's one that almost every city has. So, we would really be at a competitive disadvantage if you did not approve it. We review it every time it comes up.
Actually, Diane keeps reminding me that's up for renewal. Diane, has the next couple of years or year. Remember the industrial tax payments? It's up shortly. We have to renew that. So there'll be another opportunity for you to approve it.
Native prairie and wetlands, completely the state.
Industrial tax.
Forest and fruit trees, same thing. New jobs and income, we don't have any of those, but technically you would have some control, but not really much. I mean, if we approved a project for economic development, and they qualified for that program, the state would grant them that abatement. Geothermal systems, no control. Manufactured home shelter, and a lot of these are good things. I mean, we want people to make shelters for manufactured homes, but they do get an abatement through the state. And then TIF, we control that one also, or the council controls that. The bulk of it is under the council control, but it varies a little bit.
Okay. The past councils wanted to see that, so I don't know if you still want to see that.
Oh, yeah.
Next is a letter from Main Street with some information asking for some funding changes. I think
We didn't
that
pick them out only. We try to give you copies of any requests. So this is the only one we had, I think.
This was in a referral packet.
It came to us. I don't know
Couple
if you've
weeks
gotten
ago.
any other ones.
And then minutes from the town budget meeting, that's way back in October. We had really good attendance at that this year. And that's it as far as our special reports packet. I will point out, and Steve had mentioned at the beginning, we have the schedule of presentations that's included and posted out on the web. So for people at home or anybody that's interested in the budget but may only be interested in a very specific area, we have the page numbers along with this. So if you're, very interested in the water distribution system, for example, you can jump right to that section of the budget. So this is our schedule going forward. I will point out, and a little bit of difference in the process this year, as we had discussed a while back. I'm not sure how much the general public is aware of this. There was a little bit of the change in the way that local governments will adopt budgets this year. So at our wrap-up session on the 11th, typically at that meeting, you were setting your budget, your final budget hearing to adopt the budget, and that would usually be in early March. In fact, it always had to be because we had a deadline of the 15th of March. Now there needs to be a second hearing anytime that our total dollars are in excess of 2% over the prior year. And I think we looked back many years. I think we found one where we didn't exceed that. So I think we can assume, I mean, we're a growing city. That's a fairly small increase. So we'll probably have that hearing every year. So that requires an additional hearing where you would set a maximum levy. So for us, since we do really nail things down pretty well on that budget wrap-up session, this will just be an additional hearing. We need to do some disclosures. It needs to be posted out on social media. The states come out with some guidelines and some sample resolutions for that. So you'll be passing that at that evening. And until you hold the hearing and adopt that maximum levy, you can't set the final hearing. So at the 25th, you'll set the final hearing date for March 10th. So that'll be a little bit different for people that are following this and also for the council. And Nancy, you want to go through funds?
Sure. So every year we typically walk you through the back of the book where we have all of the different funding sources, which is what provides the funding for all of the different activities and programs and capital improvement projects that are included in the budget. So if you go to page 249, I'll just kind of walk you through them pretty quickly, kind of explain what they're used for. If you have any questions, be sure to stop me as we go through them. So on page 249, of course, is general fund, which is the one we've spent the most time on today. As Steve mentioned, the main four activities are Parks and Recreation, Library, and Police and Fire, although it does pay a portion of almost all of the general support services such as finance, city manager's office, city attorney, et cetera. But we budget it to balance every year. And as we talked about already earlier, so I won't go over it again, we have a healthy fund balance to be able to meet our 25% of revenues, and we still have enough to cover if we would happen to lose state replacement funding. And then going on to page 252 is local option sales tax. These are special revenue funds. These are funds that we have to keep separate from the general fund because they can only be used for a specific purpose, and we have to track them separately. So special or local option sales tax comes in, and as you can see, 60% of it, of course, is earmarked immediately for property tax relief and gets transferred to the general fund for that purpose, and then 40% stays here for community betterment. And as you know, it's used largely for asset funding, CODA funding, and then capital improvement projects, largely for Parks and Recreation, occasionally the library or the cemetery. We use it currently for the downtown facade program, the campus town facade program, the neighborhood improvement grant program. And yeah, we were projecting a 5% increase this year, which helps both the funding for all of the community betterment projects as well as property tax relief. And then on page 254 is hotel motel tax, which we use for economic development. A large portion of it is a pass-through to the Ames Convention and Visitors Bureau. And actually the balance in this, we've been building up for the last several years, and we did use a small amount of it this year to fund the internet study. And then on page 255 is road use tax. And we mentioned Public Works earlier. Road use tax pays for a large portion of Public Works administration, engineering, traffic, right-of-way maintenance, the snow and ice control. I mean, anything, it has to be related to the streets to be used out of this fund. I think the only thing in Public Works that's not funded through road use tax is if any work that they do for the utilities. These are paid for directly by the utility funds.
Except for substantial geo bond for actually.
Right. For the CIP projects, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yep. And then we have some public safety special revenues on page 256. We have police forfeiture funding. The police have some grants every year for different things. And then animal shelter donations are included in this category as well. And beginning on 257, we have 3 different housing funds. The first is the citywide housing program. These are funds that were left over from when we had a countywide program. Vanessa uses these to augment some things that she can't cover under her CDBG or home funding, or to pay for the local maybe portion of a project. And then page 258 and 259, we have the Community Development Block Grant Fund, which funds the whole entire CDBG program, and then the home program. We keep those funding sources separate and track them separately, and she'll go over when she does her presentation on what she's planning to use the funding for. And on page 260, we have the employee benefit property tax. This is one that Dwayne covered. It's a special levy. We could use it to cover other employee benefits. We only use it to cover police and fire retirement. So the property tax comes in to cover that, and then it's transferred to the general fund to cover those benefits. And then the police and fire pension is the one he referred to, which is the leftover funding that we've had from when we had our own system, and we've been slowly, gradually over many years using that funding to help mitigate the effects when we had large increases in the police and fire retirement system.
Dwayne, which is, or Nancy, which is the 411 fund?
Well, I guess technically it's the one on 260. So that's the contribution to the 411 system. The 261 is the closed out system that we maintain the funds that as Nancy just mentioned we can use to help offset the 411 contributions.
So just for council information, this is the one legislature is messing with right now or talking about, and it could have profound impacts on our costs. Is that correct? And if they get the changes they want, would that mean that we would have to levy more taxes to offset that, or what?
Yes.
How would we handle
In
it?
fact, what they're asking for wouldn't increase considerably our contributions to that pension fund, but it would increase substantially our healthcare costs for injuries. We couldn't cover them in healthcare anymore. We'd have to do them as on-the-job injuries.
On page 262, our Parks and Recreation donations and grants, they get a lot of donations, and we track all of those separately for especially if they're for specific projects. And that funding is available for them to do, special things that they want to do in the park system. Most of the donations that we get, I would say, are for the park system specifically. And beginning on page 263, the library has a number of special revenue funds. The first one on page 263 is actually a new one that we set up for them. It's their direct state aid funding, and they've actually had this funding in the past, but they used to use it almost exclusively for Project Smiles. They started in the last year or so using it for some different things, and they were having trouble tracking it when they wanted to use it for different uses, and they need to report to the state what they use it for. So we set up a separate fund for them to be able to track it more accurately. And on page 264 is the Library Friends Foundation. Every year they determine what they would like to fund as special things for the library, and that revenue is brought in and expended so we can track it separately. And on page 265 are other library donations and grants that the library receives. This includes donations that we receive specifically for Project Smiles, or donations for collection materials. The Harrison Barnes Reading Academy donation is here. And then on page 266, we have a fund called Library Future Needs. We set this up when the library renovation project was complete. We had some funding left over from donations, and some of it they used for some special different projects in the library at the time, but the rest of it, we thought that it would be best to set it aside since it was donated for a future project to keep it separate and start building toward whatever their next project may be.
Wasn't that one of the things on your list, Steve, of the swinging doors getting caught in the wind at the library? So why, in this case, why not use this fund
Good.
for that as opposed to
General fund.
the general fund?
Good.
It just seems like the balance is there. Just curious, I guess.
That's a good point. It's how you want to use it. In the past, we've tried to use those funds maybe to buy computers, or we give them a kind of a normal increase, anything above that. They've been doing everything besides bricks and mortar out of those funds, but you could certainly ask them to do it. It's $30,000.
Sure. Just curious. It seems like it'd be there, but yeah. Anyway.
Yep, I'm always pressing them to use that fund rather than go to the property tax payer for it. The property tax is not the payer.
Sure. Yeah.
It's a balance.
Now, in 267, we have a couple of small funds. We have utility assistance. This is for donations that we receive through utility customer service that are designated to help with utility payment assistance program. And then under miscellaneous donations, there's a small balance there. It actually says it's for public art, but I think that's inaccurate. I think it really is that $8,450 is actually bike license money that we've been holding for some time from when we sold bike licenses. So I think we did have like $100 in public art donations last year, but I think it got spent. So I think Bob made sure he did that before he retired. So this bike license money, I don't remember how many years ago we stopped selling bike licenses, but we've been holding it for some time. And I think they thought they would use it for the West Lincoln Way expansion, shared use path expansion, but they didn't need it. So it's still available to be used for something else.
We do have some nice public art on one of our bike paths, so.
Yeah.
Out in the north
Maybe we
part of
just
town.
wayfinding signs. Remember,
Yeah.
we don't have any budget for that. You directed me to.
That would
come
be a
up-
good use for it.
It's pulled though, isn't it? Or,
Pardon me?
oh, you're suggesting using it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Not already used, yeah.
And on page 268, we have developer projects. We have some developer funding that we hold until a certain time. We had it first, the Oakwood Road bike path for some time ago. You can still see that designation there, but that one has been used. But we hold the funds until such a time as the project is done so that we can use the funding. Economic development. This is funding that we use for revolving loans, any activity passed through from the state. And then on page 269 are the tax increment financing fund, which this is a compilation of the several that we have. And as you can see, this is typical. It has a negative balance at the bottom. We have the expenditures and we start collecting to pay the debt service before we start collecting the property taxes to offset that. And on page 270, special assessments, that works similar to the TIF funding. We start paying the debt service for projects that are being funded partially through special assessments. And then as we start collecting the property taxes on it, the negative balance will even out over time. And on page 271 is a street construction fund. This is where we track separately any grants or funding we receive for street projects, grants for traffic signals or bike paths or anything that we receive. So we can track them separately from the bond funds or road use tax, whatever else we're using. And on page 272 is the airport construction fund. We receive FAA funding or grant funding. We track it here. We also every year transfer the profit in the general fund that we receive from the airport farm. We transfer that into this airport construction fund as the city's local match that we may need for whatever projects are being funded through the FAA. Any questions so far? I'm going through them pretty quick. Page 273 is park development. And this includes both the park development funds that we bang $100,000 for every year out of local option sales tax, but it also includes the Winokur donation. So of the ending balance in 1819, 2.7 million, 1.9 of that was the Winokur donation, and 858,000, a little more, is actually park development funding.
So we actually have over $2.5 million in that fund for park development.
Well, 1.9 is earmarked for the Winokur donation.
Pardon me?
1.9 of that is earmarked as part of the Winokur
We're going to
donation.
use that for the swimming pool.
We can't use
Yeah,
that
so
on
that-
just anything. Yeah,
If we have a new swimming pool, I'd recommend we still use that to reduce the bond
right,
obligation.
right. But we couldn't use that on something else.
Um,
Well, we shouldn't use that on something.
no, you can.
Yeah. Oh,
I don't think it's designated for the
for a
water.
pool? Oh,
Previous city councils designated for that
I see.
to help reduce the bond cost, whatever it is. I don't believe it was given just the pool.
No, I don't think so either.
No, it
I
was
guess for some
initially, we
reason-
looked at a park.
We were looking at a park way out west, weren't we? at one
Right.
point?
I see.
But it was a policy of the city council, which can be changed.
Mhm.
But if we have another, we're going to be exploring.
Yeah, it would
indoor
reduce the
aquatics.
bond issue, sure, yeah.
It helps reduce the bond issue.
Gotcha.
But it could do the same for any other large project that we might want to do in the parks, right?
You're
Mhm.
going to do two large projects, yes.
Well,
Would a plaza be a Parks and Rec sort of, would that be in their purview, or is that considered a different type of
I
recreational
have to
space?
check on that. We designate as a plaza, not sort of park.
But I mean,
I
yeah,
have to look at the bequest, what it says. I haven't seen it in a long time.
sure. Just curious.
And on page 274 is the bond proceeds. This is where we bring in the proceeds when we issue the bonds, and then we expense the expenditures out of here for the CIP projects. And on page 275, we have two permanent funds. These are where funds that are held in trust, where we can expend the interest that we earn on them, but we can't expend the principal. So the permanent fund is the cemetery. And this is held in perpetuity for perpetual care at the Ames Municipal Cemetery. The interest actually that we earn on this shows in the general fund instead, directly. Then we have the Donald and Ruth Furman Aquatic Center Trust. And just during the last year, Parks and Rec has used a little bit of the interest that we've earned over time on this trust fund to buy a few different things at the Aquatic Center. And on page 276, we're moving into the enterprise funds. These are the funds that we operate more as a business. They follow a little bit different accounting rules. Their funding stays here and carries over from year to year. So the first one on page 276 is the Water Utility Fund.
Just so you know, our strategy in utilities is to raise rates and lock in those rates so we can cover operating costs and capital. So my point is, you might see a large balance right here that's in excess of your minimum fund balance, but over the 5 years, we plan to draw that down. It's purposeful. It's our strategy on financing capital improvements. So you might say, oh, we've got $3 million in excess. Let's go spend it on something else. But it's all in our long-range plan to spend.
And then we have to track separately the SRF funding that we receive for water projects. So on page 278, you see the Water Construction Fund. And then to pay the debt service, we have to have a separate fund for that as well. So that's on page 279, the Water Sinking Fund, where we transfer funding from the operating fund, and then we make the debt service payments directly out of the sinking fund instead. And then beginning on page 280, we have a similar situation with sewer. They have their main operating fund, which is where all of their operations and CIP projects, for the most part, go through. But on page 282, they also have a sewer improvement fund, which are the projects that are covered by SRF funding. And then they have a sinking fund as well. And then on page 284, we have the electric utility fund, which covers all of their operations and their CIP projects are shown here as well. And then on page 286, they have a sinking fund as well for their debt service. And 287 is the parking operations fund. And on 288, we set up a parking capital reserve fund to transfer, if we had excess revenue, to transfer it here to hold it to use for CIP projects. And then beginning on 289, we have several transit funds. The first one on page 289 is their operating fund. And then on 290, they also have the Student Government Trust Fund. And on 291, they have their capital reserve. So we transfer a portion out of operations every year to cover some of their capital needs into this capital reserve fund. And then this is where their CIP projects are funded. along with their federal funding that they receive, and they receive a little bit every year from ISU parking as well. And 292 is the stormwater utility. This is their operations and then a portion of their CIP. A portion of their CIP is also funded, as we said earlier, through bond proceeds. And then if they get grant funding, we track that separately in that stormwater improvement fund, which is on page 293. $294 are the operations for the Ames ISU Ice Arena. Then their capital improvements are funded, the city and Iowa State each contribute $20,000 each year into the Ice Arena Capital Reserve, which is on 295. And they accumulate that money to pay for their capital improvements that they need to do at the ice arena. And then 296 is Homewood Golf Course. This is their operating fund. They typically, their operations have never covered their CIP projects. We've funded them largely through local option sales tax over the years. They did have a $10,000 donation, which is why it's showing in the CIP this year for to go toward the clubhouse. And then 297 is resource recovery, the last of the enterprise funds. And this is, again, both their operations and their capital improvements being covered in that fund. That's all the enterprise funds. Does anybody have any questions or anything specific they want to go over?
So on page 296 for Homewood, revenues 261, expenses 298.
Yep.
So so we make up the difference through local option sales tax, is that right?
No, they're dipping actually into their fund balance. We only use local option to do if they have a capital improvement project there.
This is like the parking fund. So if you look in 2021, we're projecting that expenditures will exceed revenues by $36,000. So for that year, they didn't cover their costs, but you start the year with $201,000 balance. You'll dip into that and you'll end the year with $164,000.
How did that fund get funded to begin with?
How to get funded?
I mean, there's a fund balance. Where did that money come from?
Builds up in some years. If you have a real dry year, you make money. You exceed your
Gotcha.
revenues exceed your expenditures. Some years
So-
it's wet,
Yep.
spring, you dip into it.
And I think originally when they put their budget together, it wasn't that much of a dip into their fund balance, but this was one of the places where with their new position that they added, they shifted some people's time. And so we shifted a portion of at least of an FTE here,
70%. Right?
which they're hoping will help with the management of it. And hopefully the revenues will increase if there's someone there investing a little more time into the golf course.
But are they anticipating that revenues will go up? Not much.
No, we're hoping they will.
Not at this
but
point.
Not at this point, but that's where the person's more time to spend there. We hope they're going to promote it more.
And then
Get
with the new
around some-
clubhouse too.
And the new, and that's right. I don't even have the revenues built in for the new clubhouse. That's why I'm pretty optimistic we'll be able to boost this fund up if you allow us to build that. We can build it
Right.
because we're going to generate revenue from renting it out. That hasn't been built in here yet either, or our long range analysis yet.
Well, you probably won't, you wouldn't realize it anyway in our fiscal year.
Yeah, probably 2 years. Don't you think 2 years out? Not this year. The year
Not this
after.
year, but the year after.
Right.
I was just curious in terms of if we continue to run out of round figures, $40,000 a year clip, 4 years, that fund balance will be depleted. So I was just
We're gonna
curious
be
how we're
nervous.
gonna take care of that.
We might have to raise fees even more. We're very inexpensive compared to everyone else, but people don't like to see our rates go up. A bigger concern, not a concern, but a challenge, the cell tower lease, see that revenue is $41,000. That's not even coming from users. If that cell tower go away, now we're $80,000.
Yeah.
So that's why that golf clubhouse is very important. I think will generate revenue to help this facility.
Page 299 is the debt service fund, as Dwayne mentioned earlier, that we bring in property taxes here. This is where the debt service levy comes in, and we use it to pay off the principal and interest on the bonds that we've issued for capital improvement projects. And then we also have several internal service funds. These are funds that serve our own departments. So on page 300, we have fleet services. This is the fleet operating fund, so where departments pay in for all of their maintenance on their vehicles, for motor pool vehicles. And then on page 301 is the fleet reserve. This is where our departments bank money every year in their operating budget, so then when it comes time to replace a large piece of equipment, the funding is available instead of having to hit their operating budgets in one year. And then on page 302 is the Information Technology Fund. Similar to Fleet, this one is just the operations on page 302 where people pay for their data and communication costs. And then on page 303 is the Technology Reserve. The departments do the same thing. They bank money in their operating budgets every year. So when they need to replace either their computers or scanners or large copiers, pieces of equipment, or large software packages, they're able to utilize these funds to do that instead of having it hit their operating budgets in one year.
So when we went through the CIP, several times they mentioned about getting new servers.
Okay.
So is the reason why, is that money coming from here or how does that work?
No, I think we talked about that when we were talking about budget issues, because one of the things that, and I'll talk about that during the operating for IT. So an issue we knew of going into this year was that we're going to be switching some of our servers to the cloud. We're making some changes in IT that impact the operating budgets of our departments. And it was quite a bit more than it had been in other years. I think it was around
Right.
6%, which, I mean, in the whole scheme of things in their budget wasn't huge, but it was an issue that we thought we needed to bring up with you. So we're increasing the fees. This is an internal service, so they charge out to everybody. That means their budgets go up to pay for these improvements in the IT system. So you don't see it in the CIP, but we did talk about it in December when we were talking about the issues that we needed to look at for the budget going forward.
And that is kind of a change that's been happening over the last year or two.
It is,
That
yeah.
as more software is cloud-based, instead, we're finding that probably people's operating budgets will go up to cover the operations in the Information Technology Fund, but they're probably going to have to put less money away into the reserve fund because the cost of the PCs are less. We aren't having to buy the software anymore. So it's just kind of a shift between which area the departments are paying into.
And the timing's not the same on those. The operating is going to go up right away. And we see some of the savings on equipment over time.
Well, I was just confused that they identified server costs.
Yeah, that was
As part
what was
of-
driving the operating costs, the
But
increased
when we have-
contributions for-
Almost 2 million projected as having almost $2 million in beginning balance. I'm just surprised that it's not coming from here to buy that down and not showing up as under the.
I think that the servers, if they're being purchased, would be being purchased out of
Oh,
this.
yeah, they'd be bought
Yeah,
out
it'd
of
probably
more,
be
Okay.
part of that $844,000 expenditure.
Of the expenses are shown there.
Yeah,
and the adjusted.
because if IT would be buying the equipment, it would come out of their reserve. They don't hold that in their operations, so. And then on page 304 is the shared communication system. We have a system that we share with Iowa State and Story County in the E911 system. And we have the funding for it, and we do the expenditures for that system, and then we bill the different entities for it. So you can see the fund just breaks even every year.
Does StoryCon come out of this? Or where's that come in our budget?
Storycom is its own entity.
Right.
So the contributions that the city makes into Storycom, so there was a couple different things. We issued bonds, and we show most of that under the protective services. So the police and fire had the bulk of that expense. So that was to buy the initial equipment. And then the operating costs are in everybody's budget that has a radio.
Okay.
And they've got forecasted expenses for that. So we're really swapping the payments to the radio provider.
We're going to charge by radio. So that radio will capture the costs, the ongoing operating costs for the tower system.
Mhm.
Plus some have to pay back the bonds on the radio.
Paying back the debt.
Then on the
putting
radio.
away some money.
Those are the operating
Replacements,
costs of
that's
the
all in the
budget,
operating.
of the departments.
So are we, the city is, the city and the county and Iowa State makes up Storycom, and they're kind of helping underwrite some of the expenses of the operations, right?
No.
That was just the infrastructure.
We built the infrastructure.
Right.
And all the other smaller fire departments, volunteer
Right.
departments, other cities will be able to use that,
Mhm.
but it'll be charged back again through a radio where we're going to start collecting some of those costs from it.
So that was all covered by bonds.
Well, I don't know how the other people.
Yeah, for us, it was bonds.
for
and Iowa
us-
State
for
used
us, though.
cash.
Yeah. Okay. So there's not going to be an ongoing contribution to Storycom from the city.
You will be
And-
paying for that through our operating costs of the departments, Public Works, Water, Fire, Police, Cyride,
Per
who
radio.
have a radio.
Gotcha.
So think of it, it's a replacement cost of the radio we'll have built in there, but also there's administrative costs to run that all the tower system countywide. So we'll come up with per radio cost. But basically, we've been doing that now.
Mhm.
We paid to Electronic Engineering, who had the system. So we had to pay for the use of those towers. We did it through a per radio cost.
On page 305, we have the risk management fund. This is where we track and keep a balance for paying all of our liability insurance, property insurance, workers' comp program. And then the last one is on page 306. That's our health insurance fund, which is where the departments pay in for all of their employees for their health insurance benefits, and the employee share also comes into this fund, and then we pay the premiums out of this fund. And I think our projection this year was 3.9% increase for the departments.
Yes.
And we feel like we are dipping into the fund just very slightly, but we have a very healthy fund balance in
Self-insured.
this fund. That's the last one. Anybody has any questions?
Okay, so we hope this was informational to you and maybe the public watching. You're not going to make your final decisions. Hopefully, you're going to make your final decisions on the 11th. All the information is out there for the public to see. My experience is that the last day, the most stressful thing you have to do in making decisions, besides looking at our recommendation, is those allocations for asset, CODA, and then also the special allocation. So they're there now. Look them over, start thinking about it, because that always takes the most amount of dialogue and discussion, I think, before you make your decision. Any questions, call Deb or Brian for questions about, Deb will handle asset and CODA. Deb, are you any CODA or is it Brian? Okay. So Brian will handle CODA and special allocation. If you have any questions, Deb has asset. We want to prepare you so you can make a final decision on the 11th for that, okay?
So Steve, if we were interested in creating a new small pool of money for an individual arts grant instead of a larger program like CODA now has, which is for agencies, not for individual artists.
Is it a one-time thing, experiment, see if it works, or you do it
Yes.
forever?
No, I'm thinking
Right.
probably a one-time thing based on interest.
What I'd like you to
budget.
do, anybody has some changes in the budget, tell me before so I can be prepared to make a recommendation. You're going to have to sell it to the council
Mhm.
to vote on it, but then I don't want it to happen on Tuesday saying, okay, now where do we come up with X amount of money? So I'd rather think about it, so I'm prepared to help you if you get the votes.
But that is not, that's what I'm asking, I guess, is that's not a CODA issue. That's a new grant program that,
That's,
or whatever we decide
that's
it
up to
is.
you. Council could argue it's a code issue, and I don't know.
Okay.
That's not for us to decide. Some people might argue that, and you want to give more money to CODA, or you want to do it outside of the CODA system. you'll have to make your case on that, right?
Okay.
Maybe you'll want to talk to Brian and think if it makes sense why it would be separate, right? There's an argument to be made separate. I just don't know what you're trying to accomplish. But we can help you. We just don't want to be the last day, throw something on us, and we don't want to stay around here trying to figure it out. We'd rather be prepared for you. Okay?
Just with the parking thing from Main Street and
Yeah, go ahead.
CA.
They already told us to do it, didn't they?
Yeah, I just want to give you an update. So we have requested information. We've gotten some preliminary information from Ames Main Street and Campus Down Action Association about how much parking they expect to request funding for the upcoming year, so they can make it available for free to attendees at events. So they've given us some information. We have to crunch the numbers and figure out how does that translate into a dollar amount, but we should be able to have that for you by the budget wrap-up session for sure, so that you can consider whether you want to provide them funding through the outside funding process.
addition to?
So we have recommendations for you based on what they have requested a couple of months ago, and then we'll give you a separate figure for what the parking requests would amount to, and then it'll be up to you to decide whether you want to add those two together,
You know what I mean?
or reconfigure how much money you're giving them.
And again, we've got to come back with something for you about the auditorium fees, because that may affect, whatever you do may affect revenue, which will mean we have to increase this budget request or on the expenditure side. Give you some options there. Anything else we need to get for you before you start looking into all this stuff? The public starts looking into it, I hope. It's all there on the website. You may get calls. We hope people pay attention. This is the beginning of your deliberation. It's not the end. So there's plenty of time to give input to the council. Anything else you want? Okay. So we start Tuesday,
Yes,
5:15.
5:15,
5:15.
Tuesday,
schedule's
Wednesday,
there.
Thursday.
It's on the website too.
I'm just curious, we have at the dais capital improvement plan for Story County.
That's communication you have. Diane's just given it to you.
Okay.
Send you it.
All right,
You don't have to approve that.
maybe we could.
They might want your input.
Okay, I was just sharing with a couple of council members. It's the first time I've seen this, at the dais. So I just was curious if there was something that we were supposed to look at, or you were going to cover with us. So.
No, we're just passing it out.
Okay.
So we don't have to mail it to you. All right, well.
Any other questions for Dwayne, Nancy, or Steve? As always, just extremely well done, and
You need to thank the department heads again. They really understand the importance of coming up with the best possible services, but are aware of the cost and trying to hold the cost down for all of our utility users and our property taxpayers. They do a great job at it. And that's not always the case in organizations, but they get it here.
Okay.
So we don't need to thank them for that.
all right. To my knowledge, anything else on this item? Otherwise, we'll move on to disposition. Okay, I don't know that there's any disposition of communications to council. Is that correct? I didn't see any. Okay. Council comments? Gloria?
I have none.
Rachel?
Nothing.
David?
Nothing today.
And Bronwyn?
Nothing
All
for
right.
me.
Very good. I would entertain a motion to adjourn then.
Move to adjourn.
We are adjourned. Thank you.